Dopamine is a neuromodulator. People think of it as a pleasure chemical. It's not. It's an anticipation chemical. It doesn't give you reward. It gives you anticipation of reward. That's why it lurks behind all addictions, whether it's gambling or pornography or nicotine or drinking.
What are some daily tips, tricks, habits that people can adopt to increase their level of happiness?
Well, to begin with, you need good happiness hygiene, and that starts with knowledge. And so we talked about the fact that this is the kind of a conversation that we can have where people are going to get their best quality knowledge in a lot of ways. You're basically in the happiness business. You're giving people ideas on how they can live what you call a genius life, which is a better life, presumably, so they can be happier people. That's really important that we educate ourselves and we actually do the work. A lot of people who are unhappy are not doing the work, and the reason is because they're falling prey to a misconception about happiness, which is that it's a feeling.
Hmm.
And that, everybody's talked about feelings all the time and they want to get the feeling of happiness and they hope that it will come sit on their shoulder like a butterfly. Well, it's not going to happen. That's the
Hmm.
bottom line. Happiness is not a feeling. Feelings are evidence of happiness. You need to understand it. You need to do the work. You got to adopt the habits and you got to share it with others. That's the bottom line. You got to be as serious about your happiness as you are about your fitness. Somebody who's sitting on the couch eating Haagen-Dazs and watching Netflix going, man, I wish I could have visible abs. It's not going to happen. Which by the way, that's a pretty stupid goal too, because, if you're at that level of body fat, you're going to be miserable. But the point is that if you want to get more fit and you want to get more healthy, you got to do the work. And if you want to get happier, you got to do the work too. So you have to dedicate yourself to informing yourself and doing the work. And when I realized how many people didn't do it, that's why I dedicated myself to writing, speaking, and teaching about love and happiness and doing it for a public audience for the rest of my life. That's
Mm.
why I do it.
Yeah, and you're so good. You're so profoundly good at what you do. So when it comes to, I love this concept of happiness hygiene.
Right.
When it comes to sleep hygiene, I've got that I think pretty well figured out. When it
You
comes to
sleep
fitness
well?
hygiene, yeah, I sleep well. I
Mhm.
make sure my bedroom is cool and
Right.
dark, and
Right.
I try not to.
Well, the conditions are good, whether you sleep well or not. It depends because there's a lot of variables in that, but the hygiene is good. It's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Personal hygiene, like cleanliness, I think I've got figured out. Fitness hygiene, but like that's a novel concept.
Right.
So unpack that for us.
So fitness hygiene starts with not making a bunch of big mistakes. If I talked about getting your diet on point, the first thing I would ask about is what you're doing wrong. It's like, yeah, no, I really want a really, really good diet. I eat at McDonald's every day. Well, let's work on that. Let's take out the bad stuff. Let's correct the errors. One of the things that you find is that most Americans who have a really bad diet is because they're eating way too many highly glycemic carbohydrates. That's just a classic thing in the American diet. And you inform people about that they start to understand it. They think they're going to be okay eating something because it's little or whatever it happens to be. Stuff you talk about on your podcast with the experts who come on this show and really helpfully. So with the biggest mistakes that people make is that they actually think they're going to get happier from what Mother Nature serves up as their desires and impulses.
Mm.
But here's the first thing to keep in mind. Mother Nature doesn't care if you're happy. Mother Nature has only two goals for Max Lugavere and Arthur Brooks, which is survive and pass on your genes. And so it's all survival and gene propagation. It's get mates, be attractive, live another day. That's all Mother Nature, all of your desires. And so your desires, they tend to, they revolve around four things: money, power, pleasure, fame. Money, power, pleasure, fame. These are the idols in life because Mother Nature, we blame capitalism. That's nonsense. It's nature is the big problem, as it turns out. Okay, that means your animal nature is going to do that. But we don't have just an animal nature. We have a divine nature too. And that takes us to a different plane in which we're in the driver's seat. This is what you talk about in the genius life. You have a choice. You can live the idiot life, but let's do the genius life instead, right?
Yeah.
In your point, in your show, week after week, it's a choice. So what are you going to choose? You can chase the money, power, pleasure, fame. Flame, most people don't want actual fame. What they want is the admiration of others and prestige. The right people thinking you're good, whatever it is go to the goals that actually will reliably bring happiness, the happiness habits, the happiness 401k. And those are real simple too. If people are writing it down, let me go slower. Money, power, pleasure, fame. Okay. The right four are faith, family, friendship, and work that serves others.
Mm.
Those are the four, man. And again, you can dig into them because
I'm writing these down.
Yeah. It's, and when I say faith, I don't mean my faith. I'm a Catholic, but I'm actually a social scientist. And it's very clear That's not even necessarily a religious faith. I mean, Ryan Holiday gets it through our mutual friend through the Stoics.
Hmm.
And I know a lot of people who do it by analyzing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, or walking in nature without every morning before dawn without devices, or practicing the religion of their youth. If you practice your Jewish faith, you'd get it. Or if you became a Buddhist, you'd get it. The whole point is, do something transcendent to you.
Hmm.
See, what really holds you back is the obsession with the me, 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 and the Mother Nature wants you to be obsessed with you. My job, my well, lunch, my money, my commute, it's so boring. It's
Yeah.
so tedious. And the transcendent zooms you out on the realities of life, which are bigger than you.
Is total transcendence of the ego then the solution, or do we need to have a little bit of both? Because the ego
We
also
have
keeps us
both.
safe and
Yeah, yeah,
protected.
totally. Again, I mean, you need everything is balance. This is the Aristotle's golden mean. It's not to be floating above the clouds all the time. I mean, you got stuff to do is the bottom line, but you need relief. You need peace. You need perspective, and the transcendent in your life brings you that. It's
Mm,
really important. Everybody listening to us should be doing at least 15 minutes a day of wisdom literature reading.
mm.
Something that bigger than ourselves. The Zen and the art of archery, the miracle of mindfulness. If you want to start in the East, start there. There's a lot of stuff in the West too. Read anything that Ryan is putting out, Ryan Holiday is putting out on the Stoics, and read it for 15 minutes a day. You get hooked.
Wow.
You'll really get hooked. Second is family life, which people, 1 in 6 Americans is not talking to a family member today because of politics,
Wow.
which is insane.
Yeah.
It's stepping over $100 bills to get the nickels.
Mm.
It's so crazy. There's only one reason to have schism with your family, and that's abuse. And political differences are not abuse. They're differences of opinion, is what it
Okay.
comes down to. And it's crazy how often I see that. And so, like, call your mom. If you like, my mom died young, dementia, it's like yours.
Yeah.
I wish I could,
Same.
right? But if you can, it's, stay close to your family. These are mystical relationships.
Mm,
Family relationships are love relationships you didn't choose. They were chosen for you. That's a very mystical thing.
mm.
And that's a very powerful thing. Really important. We shouldn't take it's not something we should ever trivialize. Friendship is no joke. People who are listening to the Genius Life are total strivers. I get it. They're not listening to you because they want entertainment. They want information that they can actually use, that'll make progress in their lives. The problem that your listeners, the people that are in my classes, I teach at the Harvard Business School. I mean, the strivers par excellence is that it's all about the deal. And deal friends are no substitute for real friends. Real versus deal, baby.
Mm.
And so this is key. And so everybody's got to ask themselves, do I have enough real friends, or are these really deal friends? And the acid test on that is, are my friends useless? Not worthless. Are they too useful? Is everybody who's my friend too useful? That's a key. And then last but not least is your work. You got to earn your success, feel like you're creating value, but it's got to be in service of other people.
Mm.
So when it comes down to it, love of the divine, love of your family, love of your friends, love of everybody through your work, which I know you have. I mean,
Yeah.
this is why you're doing this.
Yeah.
It's love, 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 and more love.
I love my
different
listeners.
manifestations. And I know you do.
Yeah.
I'm one of your listeners. I can feel it.
Dude, that's so cool. I really appreciate that. Man. Okay. So family's a good one. A lot of people feel, I mean, I guess like things have shifted over the past few years. A lot of people have gone back home and are now working remotely, but in adulthood, adulthood does have the tendency to drive people apart, at least geographically.
In the States in particular. Most countries around the world, you don't leave your hometown.
Mm,
But in the States, we're super mobile. I mean, that's part of the American spirit. Who is Thomas Jefferson said, an American is a man who moves west the first day he hears the sound of his neighbor's axe.
wow, I love that. It's but yeah, this is one of the commonalities of the blue zones. I sometimes I talk disparagingly about the blue zones because I feel like a lot has been made of the dietary practices
Right.
embraced by people that live in the blue
Yeah.
zones. But um,
Really low levels of animal protein, for example.
yes,
Yeah.
which I don't
That's not my thing either because,
because gains.
well, yeah, because you want to, if you want to maintain a decent level of muscle mass, which is protective against a lot of things, you're probably going to have really efficient, nutrient dense protein sources, which mostly come from animals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. But one commonality that I think that I do agree with is the fact that it seemingly they do have that degree of connection within
right?
their cult,
They have a
their
lot of love.
yeah, a
They have
lot of love.
a lot of love connections with each other. They're not all religious in the same way, but they tend to have a transcendent viewpoint. You know, you look at the Seventh Day Adventists here in Loma Linda, for example, or the people in Sardinia. You know, these different communities, they tend to have a transcendental worldview. They're very close to their families. They have lifelong friendships, you know, leading up to when they're 108 years old or whatever it happens to be. And the work that they're doing is really in service of their community. They're not walking around saying, "Oh, I hate my job and maybe I should go back to school," and having some like weird existential crisis about, you know, trying to find my calling and
Yeah,
I'm a
exactly,
farmer.
exactly. When it comes to friends, I think a lot of people will lean on social media
Yeah,
to foster
it's a problem.
and encourage those relationships.
It's the wrong approach.
Is it?
It is the wrong approach, and you know all of the social media research is showing the same thing. I mean, my friend Jonathan Haidt at New York University, a lot of your listeners know who he is because he's been quite vocal about talking about how social media is now pretty clearly implicated in his view in the uptick in depression and self harm among young people, especially among young women. But the biggest reason is because it harms our ability to build real friendships.
Mm,
It's social media is like the burgers and fries of social life. You know, when you're really hungry, you go to In and Out Burger here in LA, and it's tasty and fills you up. But you're pretty quickly hungry again because you didn't meet your nutrient needs. You met your caloric needs, but not your nutrient needs. And a lot of obesity comes from the fact that the nutrient calorie ratio is off. So your body says, I need the nutrients, so I got to eat again, eat again, eat again. You're getting too many calories. That's where a lot of the problem comes from. Social media is the same way. I'm lonely. And so what do I want? I want a neuropeptide that functions as a hormone in the brain called oxytocin. We all heard of oxytocin. It's endogenously produced. It's intensely pleasurable. It comes from eye contact and touch.
mm,
That's the reason this podcast is better in person than if I were in my studio at home and you're in your studio here. We get more oxytocin, we get a better connection, we have a better conversation, and it's more fun, is what it comes down to. So I'm lonely, but when my brain is saying, oxytocin, please.
hmm.
So I try to go get it, but you know, I'm isolated because, you know, I'm far away from everybody and who knows where I'm living or and just the connections aren't there. So I turn to social media, which is, you know, highly caloric and not nutritive.
So we're not getting oxytocin
We're getting a
from social
trickle of
media.
oxytocin, and then we binge on it to get enough. And so the result is people spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day on social media and still feel lonely, get lonelier,
Hmm.
just like you will be in worse and worse and worse health while you eat more and more and more and more.
What role does dopamine play in this?
So dopamine is what keeps you hooked on it.
Got it.
So, you know, the payoff is oxytocin that you're looking for. But what's actually keeps you looking for that payoff is dopamine. Now, dopamine is a neuromodulator. People think of it as a pleasure chemical. It's not. It's an anticipation chemical. It doesn't give you reward. It gives you anticipation of reward. That's why it lurks behind all addictions, whether it's gambling or pornography or nicotine or drinking. All it is like, I'm going to get the reward. I want it. I want it. Desire is
Hmm.
what comes. So when the dopamine goes up, you become excellent at seeking out. And pretty much when you're addicted, you can't even resist because the dopamine is taking over your brain. It's in the driver's seat, is what it comes down to.
Hmm.
So when it comes to something like social media, it's like, I'm going to get a reward. I'm going to see who liked my stuff. I'm going to see how popular that post was. And that anticipation is being fueled by the dopamine, hoping for a little bit of a payoff, which is largely in, you know, this oxytocin, but we don't get very much of it. It's really a tyranny. You know, it's the same thing as cigarettes, for example. Cigarettes are all dopamine, no pleasure, actually. So people like they really like having their desire sated, the craving extinguished, but they don't get any actual or very little pleasure from the nicotine itself.
Hmm.
This is why it's so interesting. You know, you and I were talking before the show about microdosing nicotine, which can be really good because what it is, it's a psychostimulant that works like a little tiny bit of highly targeted and innocuous Ritalin in your brain. The problem is when you're addicted to it. When you're addicted to it, you're just like, it's driving, it's managing you. If you microdose it after 25, you can manage it. You can
Wow.
get that just little bit of payoff that you're looking for.
Is there a way to reset our dopamine systems?
Yes. So Anna Lemke at Stanford, who's been on my podcast in the past, and she's quite close to Andrew Huberman and done stuff for him. She has a great book out called Dopamine Nation. It's like for one-stop shopping for general audiences. You don't have to be a neuroscientist or you know, you have to be teaching at a university to figure this one out. It talks about the popular science of dopamine, and what you find is that dopamine it feeds on itself, and so you get more. The sort of monkey gets on your back, and you can't even conceive of being happy without having this anticipation happening all the time, and you're being driven by it, and it's a real sense of loss and grief when you don't have it. You need to actually have cessation. You need to actually pull away from it, and you have to go through a period of withdrawal,
Mm.
is what it comes down to. Now, you can try to, like with cigarettes, but everybody who's ever smoked cigarettes or drank says, I'm just going to cut down a little bit. It doesn't work. So the thing that is your thing, and people, look, we're addiction machines, man. I mean, because we like a thing and we do it too much and we get kind of addicted to it. And the way to get de-addicted to it is to just pull back and know yourself. Now, here's the good news. If you're being managed, that's your limbic system sending you signals and feelings, and that's your feelings managing you. If you know what's going on, you actually, that's why it's important that people listen to your show and shows like Huberman and they do the work, then they'll understand what's going on in their brains. And that is 3/4 of the battle.
Mm.
That is just, if you know what's going on with your brain, if you read Anna Lemke's book and you see what's going to happen, you can see 2 weeks from now, I'm going to feel a lot better. In a month, I'm going to be this thing is going to be kind of behind me. In a year from now, I can't fall back into this. And you'll be like, okay, I can do that.
Wow.
But if you don't know that, you'd be like, I just feel crummy. I'm going to feel crummy forever, because that's your brain lying to you, saying, go get me that, whatever it is, that is your thing. And so knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power. Abstinence, really,
Mhm.
from whatever that thing is.
That's right.
Abstinence makes the dopamine receptor grow fonder.
What it does is it makes the dopamine receptor less, stop screaming at you so really, really loudly. Now, keep in mind that once you've been addicted to something, you have a propensity toward that addiction probably for the rest of your life. It's carving initials into a tree. The tree will keep growing. You'll move on, but those initials will always be there, carved into the bark. Every time you go back, you're mortified by that you confessed your love for that girl when you were in junior high school, and you'll be looking at her for the rest of your life. So be careful is the bottom line.
Yeah, if you're addicted to any one activity, does that mean that you have a predilection to addiction in general? Like,
Yeah.
like a generalized predisposition to addiction?
Yeah, and there's some addictions that are closer together and some that are further apart. So if you take sleeping pills and then you go to a casino, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go from addicted to sleeping pills to becoming a gambling addict. Those are pretty far apart. But you're really, really good at dopamine, which means they're not different solar systems.
Mm.
They're close enough together. And the research on this is very new, and so we don't quite know. However, one substance to another substance, woe be unto you. If you're addicted to benzodiazepines, do not take GABA drugs, Z drugs for sleep, because they're too close together. You're going to get addicted from one to the other in just a minute. Is what it comes down to. It's what a lot of research says. And so doctors have to be really careful when they prescribe a substance that can be addictive. They should ask a bunch of questions about your past, because a lot of people, they don't know, or they're maybe not quite honest with themselves. Is what it comes down to. If you're, for example, if you've had trouble with alcohol in your life and you give it up and it's behind you, don't take sleeping pills, because sleeping pills are going to light you up, man. Your brain's going to be like, oh, I like that old feeling. I know that old song.
Wow.
Give it to me again.
Wow. Fascinating. You before we got rolling, you said something like incredibly interesting that I'd never heard of before, that if you make it to the age of 25 without any major addictions, you're kind of in the clear, like there's like an escape velocity. So if you're over 25, you can essentially do these things that would otherwise be risky and addiction forming, but with relative safety.
Now, I want to be careful about that, because you still can, if you're good enough if you do something enough, you can still become a smoker at 30. And some people do become alcoholics, later in life, who have never drunk before. I've known people who have their first drink at 35, and by 65, they have a real problem with alcohol. It takes a long time. It's a slow burn for sure. Just the odds of addiction go down as your brain becomes less plastic. And one of the reasons that addiction is such a big problem among people who took drugs as kids is because their brains are really plastic and they became good at getting the anticipation from dopamine.
Wow.
So this is the key. I mean, if you're going to get a generation of people addicted to cigarettes, make sure that they start smoking before they're 15, like I did.
Not just cigarettes, like sugary foods.
Yeah, it's just your brain adapts to it super. I remember, using nicotine for the first time when I was 13, and a month later I couldn't stop.
Wow.
In a month. Now you could use, you could use nicotine as a neurotropic drug and or chew nicotine gum all day long, and you probably wouldn't get addicted to it. Is the
Mm.
bottom line. So it's brain plasticity is what it comes down to.
Nicotine's funny. I recently met a guy who created a company. I have no affiliation, zero, with this company, but it's called Knick Knack Naturals, and he sent me a whole bunch of product. And it's like
Hmm.
the cleanest nicotine on the market, very low dose for like
Right.
microdosing nicotine. Because apparently, now nicotine, most people don't know this, but nicotine is found in all nightshade plants.
Right.
Tobacco is a nightshade, but you can also find nicotine in tiny doses in bell peppers,
Right.
right? And so his goal,
I'm eating bell peppers like by
yeah,
the
you
dozens.
see people like addicts, like
Yeah.
addicted. But apparently it's like it has like nootropic properties.
Mhm. For sure. It's a little bit of targeted, fast acting and low dose, but highly targeted Ritalin.
Mm,
I mean, what it's doing is it's a psychostimulant, and what the psychostimulants do that help you with ADHD, if you're diagnosed with that, but just general concentration, is it brings dopamine into the prefrontal cortex of the brain. One of the things that dopamine does is it gives you focus. And so if you're working on a creative project, you're writing a book or you're writing an opera or whatever you happen to do, and you smoke, man, you'll chain smoke through that project and be horribly hungover from the nicotine later. And the reason is because you want dopamine just like cruising through your prefrontal cortex. The other thing is pretty interesting, and there's some research that suggests this, is that a lot of the kids who get addicted to nicotine are those who have a bit of a predilection toward attention deficit
interesting.
issues. And so they know. And so there'll be a bunch of kids steal Uncle Joe's carton of Marlboros and take it out behind the garage. And the kids are going, gross. And one kid's going, awesome.
Wow,
Because, that's the self-medication hypothesis of addiction.
fascinating. Wow, so much there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
No.
also interestingly thought to be neuroprotective in a way. Like people who smoke is very paradoxical because people who smoke are at higher risk for many chronic conditions, heart
Right.
disease, of course, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, because smoking cigarettes like destroys,
Incredibly toxic.
yeah, incredibly toxic.
It's the delivery mechanism.
Yeah, but nicotine, there's this weird paradoxical finding where people who smoke seem to be protected from Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
And so there's this thinking that nicotine actually has like a neuroprotective.
Yeah, probably. I mean, and Parkinson's disease is from a chronic deficit of dopamine to one particular part of the brain. And so what you find is that Parkinson's patients, by the time they figure it out, there's been just a ton of damage to the brain that's happened, and they just can't deliver dopamine. And the result of that is that it has these physical manifestations like tremor and sort of an akinetic rigidity that people have. And so probably what's going on with nicotine is it's delivering dopamine to that part of the brain. I mean, we don't
Interesting.
know. That's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all this stuff is in infancy, and it's quite interesting, this body of research. We also find caffeine has all these protective properties to it. So these psychostimulants and caffeine, by the way, is more addictive than nicotine.
They're probably related, right? I mean, based on the words, I would assume that there's some degree of like,
No doubt. No
yeah,
doubt. I actually don't know the chemical properties, but I have to ask Peter Attia about that.
yeah,
He'll know that by heart.
yeah, fascinating. Okay, so getting back to like happiness, I loved at the beginning you were saying that one of the ways that most people think that they can attain happiness is by satisfying their impulses.
Right. If it feels good, do it. That's what the hippies said,
Hmm.
right? Like, if it feels good, do it. My dad, I remember he heard that for the first time. He's like, that's the end of America. Kind of right. So that's the wrong approach. And once again, it's because Mother Nature lies to you. And there's all kinds of cases, and we all know it. One of the things that when people want an example of that, the third most popular rock and roll song of all time is that. It's I Can't Get No Satisfaction.
Hmm.
And I try and I try and I try and I try. Well, something's up, man. If you can't get no satisfaction, people are like, I can relate to that.
Hmm.
My daughter said, why do you people like that? By that, she meant old people like me. And I said, it's not the song, honey.
That's a great song.
It's the message. It's actually what he's saying in that song, that Mick Jagger is singing in that song. Now, the truth is you can get it. If you couldn't get it, you wouldn't try and try and try it. The problem is you can't keep it.
Mm.
You can't keep no satisfaction. Satisfaction is the reward at the end of a project. It's is the joy and a job well done. If you strive for something and you get it, that joy is what we think of as satisfaction. And you need it for a happy life. You need it for a happy life. Now here's the lie. If you get it, you're gonna love it and keep it. If you save up your money and you go buy that watch, it's going to give you satisfaction. You're going to love it forever. That car is going to give it to you. That fame, that million followers on social media, that particular relationship with that woman, whatever it happens to be, once you get it, it's going to give you permanent satisfaction. And that's your brain lying to you because your brain wants you running on that treadmill. It's called the hedonic treadmill. More, 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 more. Why? Because then you'll survive and pass on your genes. But if
Mm.
you figure it out, if you crack the code and you're like, I listened to Max Lugavere's show and here's this like nerd from Harvard on there talking about the fact that that's not going to work. So I'm not going to try. Well, then Mother Nature gets burned. Then Mother Nature doesn't get her goal. You're not going to do that stuff. And that's exactly the way to get around it. That's exactly the way to get around it. We have to not do what feels good. We have to do what we need to do on the basis of knowledge and good hygiene, good habits, and sharing this knowledge with others.
So important. Yeah, I love it. Faith, family, friends, and work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Work has to have only two characteristics. It's not money. It's not the prestige you get from work. You got a fancy job and people know who you are and admire you, but that's not it. It's believing that you're creating value and you're rewarded for that value and that you're serving others. The
Hmm.
most important one is believing that you're actually serving other people. Those are the two things that will actually bring you joy. And so that's what we have to do. It's when, the people who work for me, I'm really critically interested in making sure that they feel like they're earning their success and serving others because that's what's going to keep them working hard and feeling good and not wandering off and working for some other Harvard professor.
Yeah. Wow. Well, lucky people, those that get to work for you. I mean, geez, the mentor that I'm sure you are to them.
I
That's
got good days and bad days, Max. It's fun. It's funny because like my wife always says, like, do you read your books?
interesting. What about, okay, anxiety?
Yeah.
That's one that like people struggle with a lot. And I feel like that's like probably distinct from, happiness
Anxiety
or
is
depression, rather.
anxiety is a cousin of depression. It typically goes with clinical depression. A lot of people have anxiety and depression. They'll take a cocktail of psychiatric drugs that will actually treat both at the same time. For the longest time, psychiatrists and psychologists, so Sigmund Freud, for example, thought that depression was a subcategory of anxiety.
Mm.
And they go together. I mean, not necessarily. Some people don't. And there's a really good book on this by Andrew Solomon called The Noonday Demon.
The Noonday Demon.
I strongly recommend that anybody who's suffering from depression and anxiety read The Noonday Demon. It's called an almanac of depression. It's the most interesting popular book on the subject. It was written in 2000, written a long time ago, but it was updated in 2018.
Wow.
It's really, really great book. I don't know him actually at all, but I read the book and I learned a lot from it. As a social scientist specializing in happiness, I learned a lot about it because he's a journalist, but he did the background, did a really good job on it. So anxiety is funny. Anxiety is something, it's almost certainly a maladapted fear response that we have. Now, fear is incredibly important. Fear is a basic emotion, which means that it's produced in the limbic system of the brain and delivered to you so that you can act on it and survive. Remember, Mother Nature says, don't get eaten by that tiger so that you can live another day and maybe pass on your genes. It's like, well, that's a great life.
Yeah.
And so how does it work? So there's a car speeding at you at 45 miles an hour, ran a red light, you're in a crosswalk, you're a pedestrian. That crosses the visual cortex of your brain, which is in the occipital lobe in the back of your brain. That sends a signal to your amygdala in your limbic system. The amygdala is a little almond-shaped thing on either side of your brain that lights up, that sends a signal through the hypothalamus of your brain to the pituitary gland, down to the adrenal glands, which sit right above your kidneys, and they spit out stress hormones in 74 milliseconds.
Wow.
That whole thing happens. Like you see the car, and within 74 milliseconds, you're shaking and sweating and trembling, and you've flipped off the driver 3 or 4 seconds before you even know what's going on. This is not implicating your prefrontal cortex at all. So the consciousness is actually long behind what's happening to this. That's incredibly important.
Mm.
Your amygdala has saved you many, many, many times. The problem that's maladapted in modern life is that these basic emotions are kind of always on. So uncertainty, right? Ego threat, all the dumb stuff that's going on. Look, you're not going to get eaten by a tiger, but you might lose social media followers, right? Something might come along and you say something you didn't mean to say and it's misinterpreted. And there's a cancel Max Lugavere thing. And among all, like I know it's not now, but you wake up at night saying, should I have said that? And what that's doing is that's giving you, it's like scratching your amygdala a little bit. Scratch, 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 scratch. Little signal to your hypothalamus down around the top and then down to your adrenal glands. You get a little drip, 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 drip of cortisol, little drip, drip, drip of these stress hormones. And that gives you this anxiety, a maladapted fear response to ordinary life. Now, that information is really critical. Why? Because somebody listening to us right now is going to go, oh, so what do I do? And some of it's obvious. Delete your account. Delete your Twitter. If it's driving you crazy and stressing you out, if your Instagram is stressing you out because of the social comparison that's going on, or people are criticizing you, life is short, man. Delete your account. I mean, start taking matters into your own hands so that your amygdala can save you as opposed to ruining your life.
What if you have to use social media?
I know.
I mean, I wish I could take this advice.
Asking for a friend, right?
Yeah.
Max?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting thing because me too. I have a very public facing job. I'm doing 175 speeches a year and I have a column and this is the storefront. Social media is the storefront. And I follow you on social media. I mean, it's like, and you're very proficient at it. You're good at it and you're funny and the whole thing.
Thanks.
You got to produce, but don't consume. Do not take the phone into the bathroom. And this is the key thing. This is a way for people to get into your head. They think, Max Lugavere's a pretty famous guy. And so he's not reading his social media. He is reading his social media. You can get to, J-Lo probably if you tweet something witty and nasty enough and she's reading it on her couch. You just got into her house. But remember, if you wouldn't let somebody into your house, you shouldn't let them into your head.
Ooh.
Really important principle.
Damn.
And
Amen.
so the key thing to do is if you need to use social media because it's part of your work, it's your work. Don't make it your hobby. And you have to protect yourself. It's really critically important that you back off it, that you're doing less. You're never using it in your leisure time. Never open up that app in your leisure time. And you have to start setting up boundaries and being conscious of it and writing it down and making goals for yourself. These are simple self-protective measures or it will eat you alive.
Yeah. I really need to take this advice because I love the world that I'm in. I love nutrition. I love what I do. I love that I get to have this platform, that I get to positively influence the lives of so many people. I'm so, so, so grateful.
Right.
But the world of nutrition is so, just like the world at large, honestly.
It's
today,
pretty crazy.
It's so polarized. It's never been like this.
Oh, I know. And part of the reason is because the vehicles for the polarization are so ruthlessly efficient. You can get a filter bubble, a vegan filter bubble in the social media space, for example, in which we all agree with each other and we hate all the the paleo guys or whatever is going on. That's not even my world, but I know enough about it because I kind of see the ballistic missiles firing from one camp to another over my head. It's a huge problem.
Yeah. Dude, it's like name calling. It's
Right.
so vitriolic.
You're killing people.
It's insane.
You want people to die.
And it's a lot of the vegans. It's like a small, it's not all vegans. It's just like it's a very small fringe group of very vocal career vegans on social media. And it's also like these like people who are like defending their credentials and everything. They see somebody like a kid like me come along who has only good intentions, right? And is putting out like fairly self-explanatory or fairly intuitive, practical advice.
And bringing on guests who have the credentials to be able to speak.
Bringing on guests who have credentials.
Yeah. With gravitas on these subjects.
Of course. But because like they see me as a threat, it's the fear. It's the fear response in them.
Yeah.
Being like projected onto me. And it's not fun. I found actually one of the best hacks I think I've discovered. At least on Twitter. I haven't figured out how to do this on Instagram yet, but you can basically mute all notifications from people who don't follow you.
Yeah, for sure.
So that you're only getting like notifications from people who support you.
Yeah,
obviously.
or people who are in your community. So
Yeah.
maybe they don't support you, but they're in your community and they're worth listening to.
But like, what do we do about this degree of inflammation that you
Right.
see now in society?
Yeah. Well, that's the polarization problem writ large is what it comes down to. And there's a whole bunch of we're angry and stupid. We hate each other and we're stupid to boot. And that's a huge, so number one is we should work on not ever being part of the problem. Number two is we need more systemic solutions. And number three, we need self-defense. And so anybody who's in the public eye has to take care of themselves. It's really, really important. And it starts with what I just talked about. If you're addicted to social media, and a lot of very public people are hopelessly addicted to social media, And part of the reason is because it's a little hit. It's a little hit. It's like, I don't know, was that popular? And what do people think of that? What does the internet think of this, that, or the other thing? Is what it comes down to. It. You must resist. You must actually learn to have the discipline, and it's the same kind of discipline that you would have with any other routine in your life. I mean, it's basically as undisciplined as always eating the cookie every time you walk by the cookie. Now, the problem is there's a very easy way. You're listening to Saladino on your podcast and some weeks ago, and he says he doesn't have cookies in his house.
Hmm.
Okay, well, then maybe you need to not have social media in your house.
Hmm.
Maybe that's what you need to do. And if you have to do it, then you have to find workaround mechanisms for it. For example, you need to outsource your social media more to staff. If you're in a public role and you've got the means, you need to hire somebody to run your social media, and you need to take the app off your phone. I mean, that's the same thing as not having like 7,000 pounds of cookies around your house when
Yeah.
when you have a propensity toward obesity. You get my point.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
totally get your point.
And then there's systemic things. We need to think more about it as a culture. We need to be thinking more about, creating a movement of people that's going to strike back against that stupid nonsense. People who make very public proclamations that they'll never participate in the vitriol and the hatred, that they will only publicly. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we had a movement of people who said, I pledge that I will never say anything that's not positive and loving on my social media.
Hmm.
Never will.
Yeah.
Won't do it because, as soon as Max Lugavere does that with hundreds of thousands of followers, and then you say, dick, somebody's going to say, because everybody's going to keep the receipts.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. But this is super valuable for people that, I mean, like, aren't public figures. I mean, social media has become so ubiquitous today, and any kid anywhere now can put up a TikTok that goes viral, and suddenly they're like under the scrutiny of everybody on a global scale.
Yeah. Now, part of this is a moment, and it's not. This isn't going to last forever. People think that social media has a permanent effect on things. That's not how fads and panics work. And fads and panics manifested in technology and products. They just don't last forever. It's a weird thing. They have a life cycle and they tend to burn out. There was this, if you go back to the 1950s, when finally every household in America had a landline phone, there was this belief that America was going to be destroyed by the telephone, that people weren't going to go out, that people were going to spend all day talking to each other. And furthermore, it wasn't actually real conversation. It wasn't real human interaction. Exactly what parents are worried about for their teenage kids and young adult kids on social media. And it became simply a way for us to do our work. I mean, the idea of what do you use a phone for? Well, it's because, hey, before this, one of our mutual friends called, hey, Max, I'm with Arthur and he's going to be a little late to tape the podcast. That wasn't, goofing around on social media. That wasn't entertainment. That was a tool.
Yeah.
And ultimately, social media is probably going to morph itself into a tool status. And I see this with my adult kids. My kids are 24, 22, and 19. And, my 24-year-old went through college in the prime, burst of social media craze. And over that, he learned how to use it in a very responsible way. He keeps up with a small group of friends. They decide what they're going to do and how they're going to see each other in person so they can actually get the oxytocin that they crave. My middle son, he's a active duty combat Marine. He's a sniper in the Marine Corps. And he realizes that it compromises him in all sorts of psychological, maybe even physical ways for him to have an active social media presence. And so he doesn't, is the bottom line, because he's a war fighter, not a couch potato. That's what it comes down to. And my little girl, and she, and she's 19, she's in college still. And she's like, it's boring. It's just boring. That's progress. And this is not just because they're my kids. I see it more and more. I think that this is going to be a receding problem in the next 10 years.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's already a huge problem. It's already a huge problem, but I think people are not acknowledging it as such.
Yeah, well, a lot of people have an interest in not acknowledging it, or they don't understand. And so, particularly as the information becomes more ubiquitous about the self-harm that it's engendering because of the psychological problems that it's stimulating, particularly among young women, there are going to be more rules around it. But I do think there's going to be a natural life cycle where this problem will be self-limiting.
Talk about, because I heard you on another podcast talking about the difference between love and hate, and describing love and hate as being essentially this
Love and fear.
Well, love and fear as being like opposite sides of
Right.
the coin, and then hate actually being sort of an extension.
Of fear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's actually what we find. And that's just what you brought up. The jealousy, the petty struggles that people are having on social media, which are expressed as hate and contempt. Contempt is disgust plus anger.
Mm.
It's the conviction of the worthlessness or the expression of the worthlessness of another human being. It's the best and fastest way to make a permanent enemy is to express contempt. Roll your eyes when somebody says something and they'll say, Max just basically said, I'm worthless and stupid.
Mm.
Max just said he hated me, even though you didn't intend it. That's what lies behind the polarization problem in American politics today is inadvertent expressions of contempt. We're like a couple on the rocks. The whole country is a couple on the rocks, and you need to retrain their communication, and they can actually get better. Normally, that's from the best literature on marital reconciliation. That's the case, and so I think that really works for America as well. But the hatred that comes that is stimulated by the fear that people have and the insecurities and the anxiety that people have. And so this is an expression of a deep-seated need for relief is when you see this hatred. And when you see it as such, by the way, it's a lot less threatening. When somebody reaches out and punches you, right? And you see that's like, man, that there's some issues here, man. There's some real issues here. It gives you a much greater sense of equanimity and a sense of compassion towards somebody else. And it's helpful. I mean, you're in the public eye and I have a very public job as well. And early on, I would get this like hatred. This is even before big internet stuff. The first book that I had that ever was very, very public was 2006, and I was getting all this hate mail. I was like feeling very defensive.
How could somebody who's dedicated his career to showing people how to be happier have haters? I just don't understand.
How could
that.
you have haters? Your whole it's the genius life. You want the best for everybody, and yet
Jesus.
it's a crazy world. But you got to recognize that when you express compassion in a world that has a lot of hatred and fuel for hatred, that there's going to be resistance to that.
What's the best way to deal with haters?
Love is the best way to deal with haters. So this is, the religious principle that has been most tectonically changing in human history is in the Gospel of St. Matthew, 5th verse. I promise I'm not, turning this into a religious discussion.
No, I'm into it. I'm down.
The 44th verse of the 5th chapter, which is love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. That has totally changed humanity. Love your enemies. Why? Because it's completely counterintuitive and it fights Mother Nature, but it also changes the conversation internally. So you might not change your hater, but you will change you.
Hmm.
And that's the whole point. There's a whole body of work in my world called on what's called metacognition. Metacognition is awareness of awareness. It's very related to the whole debate on consciousness. Where does it reside? Is it a purely physical phenomenon? Does it reside outside the individual? Is there something in the ether? What is consciousness? And that's a whole conversation for sure. But metacognition is really interesting because it is a technique in which we can be delivered very powerful emotions, and we can decide by experiencing those emotions in the prefrontal cortex of the brain how we will react. You can't decide I'm not going to feel emotions unless you just take a lot of drugs. You're going to feel emotions. The question is, how are you going to react to those emotions? And are you going to experience them in such a way where you're in charge of your reaction? Metacognition says, absolutely you can. Absolutely you can. And love your enemies is the classic case of that. When somebody delivers you hate and you say, I got a policy. Every time somebody says, I hate you, you say, I love you back. And it's just, at first this feels really unnatural. And after about 10 minutes, you're going, I'm in the groove, baby. And it's really life-changing.
Well, like everybody has haters, right? Whether it's like a coworker that just like doesn't seem to like you,
Right.
or I mean, haters are everywhere. Like we were talking about social media and like the problems that you have as a quasi public figure, but I feel like these are really important tools for people when somebody when somebody insults them or doesn't see them the way that they had hoped, something like that, like really useful.
Yeah, for sure. And
Advice.
part of the problem is that people will also take critics and say that they're haters. And we can get a lot of benefit from people who give us criticism. It might not always be in a spirit that's entirely charitable, but as my father used to say, my father's a really wise and wonderful man. He died young, sadly, but he's a scholar. And he said, like, I don't want the truth, but I need it. And your critics aren't always right, but there's always something kind of interesting. And to declare that you are going to have the humility. It's like, I'm going to have the humility to hear things, right? And furthermore, by the way, the worst thing that can happen to your happiness is that you don't have the humility. Pride is a killer for happiness.
Mm.
It's like thinking that you're a big shot is just horrible for your happiness. It's related to the fact that fame is the only one of the worldly rewards that you can only ever be happy in spite of. And so,
Whoa.
taking the truth, taking other people's versions of the truth, answering hatred with love, listening to critics, thinking about it honestly, rejecting it when it's inappropriate. These are real secrets to happiness. If you've got the intestinal fortitude and the discipline to take it on.
Interesting. Are there any, like, I don't know, affirmations, like when if somebody insults you, if you hear somebody like has insulted you or spoken unkindly of you to a friend or on or at you on social media in the comments, because I feel like this is a fairly human common
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. Yeah. For number one, never be defensive.
Never be
Never, never,
defensive.
never be defensive. The worst look is when a public figure is defensive
Mm,
because everybody can see it from a mile away. There's a bunch of things that public figures do that they think are not obvious, but absolutely are. Humble bragging is another. There's a bunch of literature from social psych guys on humble bragging, and people recognize it and hate you when you humble brag. You're like, they won't know. It's like,
hmm.
going to see the president, but all I have is wrinkled suits. That kind of thing. People think you're an idiot and they hate it. But another is and it's really important is defensiveness. When you look defensive, it makes you look. People see weakness in defensiveness.
Interesting.
And it's Brene Brown calls it vulnerability. I think of it more as and it's great. Her stuff is great. I think of it a little bit more as defenselessness. Right. And part of the reason for that is, I mean, you've got defenses for sure. You're not going to let somebody into your house who hates you as a loaded gun, obviously. But sticks and stones, man.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest problems with our culture is this theory that has been propagated by social scientists, sadly, that words are violence.
Hmm.
This idea that somebody insulting you is the same thing as hitting you over the head with a baseball bat. And that's just pure nonsense.
Right.
I mean, I can come up with 100 studies that show that it affects the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex of the brain, which is the part of the neocortex above the limbic system that's stimulated by both mental and physical pain. I mean,
Hmm.
it actually stimulates the same part of the brain when your girlfriend breaks up with you and when you stub your toe. It's the same part of the. It's the reason that Tylenol, by the way, can help you feel less depressed
Crazy.
because it's anesthetizing or it's muting the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex of the brain. Okay, I got it. But I'm not going to turn that into some newfangled crazy theory that words are violence because that all that does is just screws up our entire society and gives me cancel culture toot sweet. I don't want it, man.
No.
And I don't want to live that way. I don't want to be aggrieved. I don't want to be a victim just because I'm lucky enough that people buy my books and I'm going to turn that into some sort of aggrieved status. That's crazy.
It's weird that the same people, though, that would say words are violence also have said that silence is violence.
Yeah. Well, no, everything is violence if you don't agree with me.
Yes.
And that's just mind control is what it comes down to. There's this in the middle part of the 20th century, Orwell, who fought in the Spanish Civil War and was an expert on mind control. I mean, he wrote 1984 after all. It's very interesting. He talked about the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes are those where you can't say what you think. And by the way, there's a lot of authoritarianism around us that we accept all the time. If you go work for IBM, you can't just like walk around cussing up and down the halls. And so
Right.
that's a form of authoritarianism for sure. In government, it's less good, obviously. Totalitarian regimes are those where you can't think what you think
Mm.
or where you're supposed to think something else. And you can be accused of and persecuted in some way for thought crimes or where people think you think the wrong thing. And that's the period that we're in when we say that speech is violence, because an extension of that is silence is violence. And that's just pure totalitarianism is what it comes down to. And so no matter where you are on the political spectrum, it's going to come for you unless you fight against it. And that's really something we all need to stand up and say, look, I believe in free speech and I can handle it.
Absolutely. So going back to defensiveness, would you say that the best course of action in those moments when one feels attacked is to practice like non-reactivity and just to ghost,
Yeah.
to not
Well,
respond?
sometimes, yeah. So it depends on what you're up for, is what it comes down to. I mean, there's some, I have, a couple of good friends who are younger members of the U.S. Senate, and the attacks that they take are so withering. I mean, it's like a kid's birthday party, what you and I are putting up with.
Mm.
And some of them they have kind of a practice of reacting either with love or with humor. Now, humor is different than mockery. right? You don't want to mock somebody and say, "Yeah, no kidding, I'm stupid. Well, you're ugly." I mean, that's not helpful because that's just another tit for tat. That's just insulting and that looks defensive. But it's like former Senator Ben Sass from Nebraska was a super smart guy, and he used to, and people would say all sorts of terrible things about him. He would, and he was when he was a lot on social media, which he hasn't been in recent years. He would say, right back, "Tough but fair."
Hmm.
As if he agrees, even though he obviously doesn't,
Hmm.
and it's just deflecting a little bit. Or one of the things that I found, I got an email from a guy years ago who had read one of my books, and it's like, "Dear Professor Brooks, you're a fraud."
Oh.
And it's like going through, line by line by line by line. It's just an email. It wasn't on social media. And I remember thinking, he read my book. And so I wrote back to him and I said, it's just, I'm not some sort of saint, but I said, like, it took me 2 years and my whole heart to write that book and you read every word. I'm actually, I'm really, I mean, I realize you thought it was terrible, but I'm grateful to you. And within 15 minutes, he wrote back and asked if I'm ever in Dallas, if I want to get dinner and discuss it. He went from mortal enemy to kind of a friend just because I answered with a little bit of heartfelt friendship.
Wow.
Is what it comes down to. That's what love your enemies can do. And even if he hadn't, even if he decided he hated me more, which could happen, my heart was a little bit on fire.
Hmm.
I mean, I felt good because, my mom would have been proud of me
Hmm.
for answering that way.
Yeah, you answered beautifully. I don't always um, answer in ways, respond in ways that I think are productive. But what I'm trying to get better at is just practicing like non-reactivity, not responding.
Yeah.
Because especially on social media, it's like it's so easy to just like get involved in
That's
it.
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Non-response is always better than negative response.
Mm,
I mean, that's like, first level
yeah.
is always make sure you get to that. There's no reason, particularly for you. Um, you're well known. You're an easy target. People are trying to increase their status by engaging you negatively. So you're just all
You're
you
right.
do is you feed the beast.
Yeah. I've never regretted not responding, but I've often regretted responding.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
What role does self-care play in happiness? I don't know if it fits into any one of the four tenets that you already gave me, but like, exercise, eating a healthy, nourishing
Yeah.
diet.
That's a pretty interesting question because it turns out that happiness and unhappiness reside largely in different hemispheres of the brain. People tend to think that unhappiness is the absence of happiness. It's not. Unhappiness is largely it's a set of emotions that are produced in neuroscientifically. They're distinct, largely distinct phenomena, as it turns out. Now, that's important to understand because if you're trying to raise your happiness, that doesn't mean you're lowering your unhappiness. You can both be very high and or very low in either or both. There's a test called the PANAS test, the positive affect negative affect test.
Mm,
PANAS. You can find it on my website, or you can find it at a lot of different places around the internet. And you take it, you can find out if you're a high positive affect and or high negative affect person. I'm unusually high in both.
mm,
That's called the mad scientist profile. I'm way happier than normal, and I'm way unhappier than normal.
mm.
You probably are too. You're a high affect guy.
Isn't that like bipolar disorder or
No,
something?
no, not necessarily. You're going back and forth. You're oscillating in dangerous ways. But the truth is that if you tend to see things as either great or terrible, that's probably your profile. And that tends to be a highly creative profile and a highly productive profile, but it's not always fun. If you're high positive, low negative, that's the cheerleader profile. And that's what everybody wants to be, but that's not necessarily the best. They're not the best CEOs. They don't want anybody around them who's negative at all because
Mm.
it brings them down. They don't like it. There's the high negative, low positive. Nobody wants that. Those are the poets, but they tend to be highly creative and they have really important input if they can manage themselves properly. And then there's low, low. Those are the judges. Those are low affect people. You want them in, hedge funds and, you know, public utilities and, things where it's really, really important that you're calm. I had a student who, he's saying, how can I be, he took this test and he was a judge. He's like, how can I be a good CEO? I'm a judge. I'm a low affect person. I said, what was your job before you came to the Harvard Business School? He said, I was an Israeli Secret Service agent. I'm like, perfect. We don't want, a spy effectively going, oh my God, all the time, or a surgeon. And so in other words, there's a role for everybody is what it comes down to. Okay, now getting back to your question, happiness and unhappiness are distinct. You need unhappiness to be happy. And the reason for that is that you have to do unpleasant work You have to strive in ways that are not always fun to get your satisfaction. You have to suffer a lot to find meaning in your life. Without unhappiness, you will avoid your happiness, which
Mm.
is why the goal of not being unhappy is the wrong goal. You need to manage your unhappiness. The best way to manage your unhappiness, among other ways, is hard exercise. That doesn't make you happier. It makes you less unhappy.
Mm.
Now, that's the reason that if you have one of the personality profiles I just talked about before, if you're a low negative affect person, either you're a judge or you're a, according to what I just talked about, or you're a cheerleader, you're going to have a hard time staying on an exercise protocol because you don't have that much negative affect to lower.
Mm.
So you're like, I don't know. It's just like never makes me feel better. That's because it's not going to make you feel better. It's going to make you feel less bad. And if you already don't feel very bad, you don't have very much of that discomfort to lower. And so it's going to be harder for you to stay in shape.
Interesting.
For me, I miss one day a month. The reason is because I'm very high negative affect. And it makes me feel a lot better.
Mm. I think I am too, actually.
For sure you are. For
And
sure you are. I mean, I've listened to you. You talk about real things, and yeah.
Yeah, I am prone to, uh, yeah, I definitely think that I get low lows and I don't get very high highs. Like I was the kind of kid that, and to this day I struggle with like,
So you're more poetic, maybe.
yeah, well, I consider myself an artist. I've always considered myself
Mhm.
an art, or at least since like my mid 20s.
So tell me more about this, not the lack of high highs.
Well, I chronically feel bored, even though I know that I love what I do. You know, I chronically seek novelty. Like I'm somebody who really enjoys novelty, but also hates uncertainty and like planning and scheduling. So I end up staying within my own little kind of comfort bubble and not being very excited about it. And and yeah, I was just as a kid, I was like I was somebody who just like I was always the kid at the parties that like wasn't really having as good of a time as everybody else, no matter the party. And yeah, it's just something that like, you
You were
know,
never into it. You were never into it. Like that weird kid who's jumping up and down. It's like a bounce house. That's the best thing ever.
yeah.
Max is like, "It's not that great a bounce house."
Yeah, I'm pretty hard to please. Like I don't really enjoy popcorn like entertainment, like
Yeah.
I'm much more like I love to like sink my teeth into things that are like more complex, have more,
Yeah.
greater complexity. And so it I find myself just like harder to please myself.
Yeah. Well, part of it is that you're an intellectual novelty seeker. You wouldn't be actually popping from one major topic to the next every single week, delving into somebody's body of work. I mean, you know what I do for a living. That took work. That means you're an intellectual novelty seeker.
Mm.
You would have been a very, very natural scholar. Somebody who's, a public intellectual. Now, interestingly, these, again, your world and my world have converged. And so I can, I'm in your world right now. It's very easy for you to imagine you in my world.
Yeah.
And that's because, people who are in self-improvement and fitness and longevity and people who are just researchers are now cross-hatching with each other.
Yeah, it's
Right.
interesting.
It's a really interesting thing for sure. But it also means that you in your novelty seeking did it fairly autodidactically.
Yeah.
And probably under different circumstances, you might have gone and gotten your PhD.
Mm.
And that would have been a different way of satisfying this urge that you're meeting every week by doing your podcast.
Yeah. No, I love it. I love the structure of the podcast. And I really intended when I started college on going into science, but I had, I think, a little bit of like low grade ADD and was never really able to focus on things that I wasn't obsessively interested in.
Yeah. It's also the case that people in their 20s don't have fully formed prefrontal cortex of the brain.
Mm.
And so it might have been that you got to your level of concentration late, which is very common for young men in particular. Were you a partier when you were a kid?
Uh yeah, I mean I definitely fell into like early, drinking and in high school.
Light drug use?
A little bit. I
Yeah.
mean I never really liked THC, which was the drug du jour.
Of course not. That's going to just, all that's going to do is it's going to mute you.
Yeah.
It's going to make it dumb. And if you don't want to be made dumb, if you want to be made more interesting, I mean, a bigger danger for you would be cocaine.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
You're
why I've
like,
never tried it.
you're like, this is awesome. I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to this hobby because I really, really like it.
That's why I've never tried cocaine.
Good.
Ever.
Yeah. And you shouldn't. I mean, substances that are supposed to give us experiences that are non-organic are just not good for us.
Mm.
As a general rule, don't do that. There's things that you can enhance ordinary experiences slightly, and the things that give you new experiences.
Mm.
Be very, very cautious with the second category of things, because what you'll wind up doing is it's a substitute for actually being alive.
Why is it though that some people seem to thrive with THC and others really do not?
Well, part of it is that people who thrive with THC, and I don't know if that's actually true
Mm.
necessarily. I think that we that's a big experiment, and I think that probably Huberman would dispute that. He's very dubious of drugs and alcohol, especially and cannabis and alcohol. And I think that the research supports his doubtfulness on this, because I mean, we're conducting this unbelievably unprecedented human experiment across our whole society. Of saying, "Hey, give it a try, man.
Yeah.
It's all good. You can buy it at the corner store." I mean, I'm not saying it's bad or good, but it is a big experiment, and I think there's a lot of research that's going to come to bear in the coming decades to say whether or not it was as interesting and good and motivational and didn't have long-term deleterious consequences. In the meantime, I'm not doing it.
Yeah, dude, I would tend to agree with him. And I'm not an expert in THC, but just based on my own subjective feelings when I'm on it, it makes me psychotic. I can't understand how.
Some people can handle it better. Some
Yeah.
people can, and people have different cognitive and psychological profiles, for sure. Everybody reacts, as you know, because you experiment with nootropics and supplements, very lightweight stuff, and so do I. I mean, we're all using that stuff. Some people get a benefit, some people don't.
Yeah.
Some people are hyper reactors, some people are non-reactors to different things, and the same is true for recreational drugs.
I do tend to really enjoy psilocybin, like mushrooms.
Yeah.
I don't take them often, but I've enjoyed microdosing them like in the past.
I fear that. And the reason I fear that is because I have a lot of mental illness and psychosis and dementia in my family.
Mm,
And there's not enough research that suggests that it's safe for people who have those tendencies.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, for dementia though, I would. I mean, I know that this data, doesn't exist, and I don't want to like give anybody false hope or anything, but I would be inclined to think that psilocybin mushrooms would potentially help.
I hope so. Well, most likely when we have all of the research, it'll suggest that it helps some and not others,
Mm,
and it's dangerous for others. And that would be the same for any drug.
yeah, exactly.
That would be it'd be weird if we didn't find that, quite frankly. I mean, I can imagine finding that it's not actually good for anybody, but we're not going to find that it's good for everybody.
Yeah,
And so what we're going to have to figure out is, what's your profile? What are your proclivities? What's your problem? What's your tolerance? How old are you? What have you done in the past? And we don't have any of that research yet. I mean, it's in its infancy. I'm very hopeful too, because I want better treatments for mood disorders, for
yeah,
example. And the treatments that we have for mood disorders just aren't very good, and a lot of people are suffering.
mm, yeah. SSRIs and like all those.
It's tough, because a lot of that is just that we don't know. We kind of know the mechanism of action, but it's just like I like what that one did to that guy, so let's try this in this combination, and not to minimize the importance of psychiatric drugs in people's lives. I mean, I've had people in my family who survived because of these drugs, but there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, you're right. So have we cured or solved depression, anxiety? I feel like we covered
No,
a ton of ground.
well, did we certainly didn't solve it, and
Yeah.
the medical profession hasn't solved it either.
Mm,
But the biggest thing that all of us can do that's non-pharmaceutical is informing ourselves, is knowledge. I mean, I got into this business. I'm a social scientist. I've gone through a lot. I did a lot of work on beauty. I did a lot of work on philanthropy and charity. And I wound up specializing in happiness because I have a mission. And my personal mission is to lift people up, bringing them together in the ideas of love and happiness using the best science. And that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. That's what God put me on earth to do, is
mm,
to share these ideas and lift people up. And I know that knowledge is the most powerful thing. It's more powerful than drugs. It's more powerful than any other intervention, is knowledge that we can have. And I know you agree, or you wouldn't do this podcast.
yeah.
What's the most important thing that you can do to turn your life around? Is figure out what the genius life is and live it.
Mm,
But you got to figure it out first. You got to do the work, man. And the people who don't want to do the work, they're nowhere. That's what
mm,
it comes down to. So when we talk about depression and anxiety or any other mood disorder or any other disruption in our day-to-day life, do the work. You're your own research subject. Figure it out. You know, and the research is readily available.
yeah.
Everything is at your fingertips. It's so exciting. You can solve so many problems by doing the work.
Yeah. And when in doubt, try as best you can to put your focus back towards faith, family, friends, work.
Yeah. That's right. Love, 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 and more love. Different manifestations of love. To love and be loved is the secret to happiness in this life, and it will solve a multitude of problems, and it will give our lives, give us what we really seek, which is to be fully alive.
Yeah.
In the good and in the bad, and taking a big bite out of all of it.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
But we are also meant to go back to equilibrium when the threat is removed. What we think happens is that people who are isolated and lonely don't have those people who can help them calm down, who can help them return to baseline.